notes. We now have a panel session with all the agents involved so that this kind of employment it becomes a reality, so that we're able to have quality and inclusive employment in a competitive and globalized economy. We have with us Professor Íñigo Calvo from the University of Deusto. He is a member of the UME Research Group on Aging. He is from the Business Alumni Group and the Club of Rome Group. And he's also worked in Deloitte and in the Economic Office for the Presidency of the Basque government. Welcome. Good morning. Well, the important people are those that will make up the panel, and that I'm going to introduce. First of all, Secretary General of UGT, Raúl Arza, the Secretary General of Comisiones Obreras in the Basque Country, Loli García, then Eduardo Arechaga from Confebasque, and finally the Elena Pérez, Deputy Minister for Employment.
Eguerdión a todos.
Good morning, everyone.
Tenemos una hora. Bueno, lo primero de todo, trasladar a... Bueno, es un lujo.
First of all, I want to say it's wonderful to have this panel discussion with all of you here. Now we have Elena also joining us. And it's wonderful to be able to moderate this after Mr. Costa's lesson, because we cannot speak about quality and inclusive employment in a competitive and globalized economy if we don't take into account the social contract. Businesses want business contracts on the table, but to do that we need a social contract that provides its support. And the previous speaker clarified many ideas. Well, we have 4 big areas that we will be addressing. I'm going to be the timekeeper, so I will ask everyone in the panel to please expose your ideas, that we can discuss, comment, and that there is fair play, and that everyone answers in order. My first question has to do with a tripartite dialogue and social dialogue. Last year, we started this conference with a wonderful talk by Valeriano Gómez, a former employment minister. He talked about the relationship of social dialogue. Last year, we were in one of the waves of the pandemic, and Valeriano said that the good thing that came with the storm is that social dialogue had been reactivated, and that citizens felt calmer in the life of uncertainty to see the trade unions, businessmen, workers, everyone was talking to each other. So my first question is, how do you see the situation? Is the social dialogue reactivated after a year and a half of the pandemic, obviously in Madrid, but also here in the Basque Country? So who would like to start? If you don't mind, I'll get started. Well, we need to feel proud of social dialogue in Spain and in the Basque Country. We have data that shows that we've been able to confront a crisis in a totally different way. And of course, success comes from consensus and social dialogue. Social dialogue and agreement deal with 3 ideas that I believe are very important. First of all, that agreements between workers, businessmen, and governments creates more social cohesion. They are also more balanced, because the three parties involved are participating, and also these dialogues will last more in time. In the Basque Country, we've been able to complement the agreements reached in Spain, like all the subsidies that we've been able to give to workers, those workers that don't make as much, and we've been able to complement their benefits and their situation with more support for those that had an income under 20,000 euros. Also helped our freelancer workforce, and we will talk more about this throughout this panel session. I think we should feel proud of how we've been using the tool to provide a solution in a complex situation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Raúl. Loli? Social dialogue? Well, we believe social dialogue is a tool. It's a tool that should be the foundations for the creation of what Anton mentioned, the new social contract, because it's the tool that union organizations, business unions, and social agents have to be able to have an effect on public policies. Public policies also have to come into play, and we can all contribute so that we achieve what we've all been mentioning, reducing inequality and establishing new mechanisms that provide new content. Why is social dialogue important? It's important because policies that are reached through consensus last longer and are used more than those that are either imposed or not discussed enough. And the tool of social dialogue, and Raúl said so, we've seen in this year and a half of the pandemic how useful it is. We've been trying to save the situation when living in uncertainty and risk. But now we need for these policies to really be effective where we have real problems. That's what we need to focus on. And to do so, all the parties have to have real commitment to agree, find agreement, and find consensus, sometimes having different mindsets. And that's a social dialogue, the tool that will provide us the capacity to have an effect on public policies. Thank you, Loli. Eduardo from Confebasque. I believe social dialogue is relevant, but it's a bit different. My vision is a bit different to that of Loli. I don't think we have to have an effect on public policies, because I've always going to try to do so, whether there's social dialogue or not. This is a task that, as a representative of society, I have to carry out. What's relevant about social dialogue, and now, and the previous speaker has explained it, the key to this moment is that we are in transition. We're going to go from scenario A to scenario B, but when moving from one to the other, that's where we find the uncertainty, where we don't see that fog, as he said, and where we don't see three elements that are very important in a country, and that is institutions, businesses and its representatives, and the workers and its representatives.
We have to do this all together in an innovative, harmonious way, and that's really important. I don't know which energy is going to be the winning energy in 2030, or which kind of digitization is going to be predominant. I have no idea, but what I do have is I'm determined to carry on living or being alive in 2030 or 2040, and as a country, I mean. So each country can't just decide that they want to pull in their own way. No, altogether we need to decide how we transition from one state to another. For me, that's what's relevant in society. Building a new future, but a future that's in transition, and nobody is the holder of the complete truth. Nobody has every solution within their reach. That's what makes it valuable. This third part, the government. For me, social dialogue isn't an option that we can choose. It's something that's a need. It's a democratic need and obligation, because social dialogue in a democratic social society that's based on the rule of law is necessary, and that's key if we're in a social state, and that requires the participation of business organizations and trade unions, and also because social dialogue is key to promoting social progress, because it helps organizations that at an outset have opposing interests and brings them together, because the social contract has implicit into it conflict. So there are two alternatives to that. One, which we're seeing in society, which is the alternative of maximalisms or destruction. We see that in politics. It's either black or white, but we need to remember all these range of greys, which is social dialogue. I always think that we need to build a society in which social dialogue has a presence, so that public administrations, trade unions and businessmen do everything within their power to serve the society that we're in. Because I'm convinced that over and above ideological options or interests that we may have, there's one thing that is clear, and perhaps it's the only thing that all three of us are clear on, which is that we want a better society, a society that has a future. Let's move on to the second question. This was like the amuse-bouche. We've seen how what's important was here three different corners. We don't know what the world will look like in 2030, but there is something that is changing, which is demography. There's demographic change. Let's not be alarmist, but we do need to think about how demographic change, and the Commissioner spoke about that, Mr. Schmidt, demographic change, which both the government, the Basque government, is concerned about, as well as the regional ministry. We're going to be seeing a silvering of the economy, not just in the Basque Country and Spain, but in the rest of Europe. And this is, of course, going to have an impact on the labour market. According to the Basque employment strategy, there are 500,000 people on the market and the employment market that'll be gradually leaving the labour market in the next decade. And that's going to bring about a profound change. There's also good news, which means that there's going to be new demand, up to even 110,000 new jobs. What do you feel about the effects of this demographic change on the labour market, on jobs? So I'd like to start with Eduardo. Eduardo, I know it's a subject that you're concerned about. Of course, Confebasque and the rest of the social partners are concerned about this. How could I summarize what I want to say here? The Basque country started the 21st century with a marked demographic decline. We've lost 100,000 people of a working age in our society, and you can see that in that it's increasingly difficult to find people that are well prepared to occupy jobs. We're talking about skilled workers, but now I think there's a lack of waiters, drivers, engineers. Gradually, in the surveys that we've seen, this is actually increasing. In 2016, it's 5 out of every 10 By 2018, it was 7 out of every 10. Now it's 7 to 8 out of every 10. And I'm sure if we carry out the survey again, you'd see that it was 9 out of every 10. So what's going to happen here? Well, we're going to be one of the European regions which has a very small amount of raw material. You've given us the data, but according to the Basque Employment Society, there are going to be 500,000 people leaving the job market over the next 10 years. According to Eurostat's figures, only 400,000 are going to be ready to replace them, so 100,000 are going to be missing. And you've said that a further 200,000 euro because of the increase in number of jobs. And if there's not jobs, there's no economic growth. So there'll be economic growth if we've got 110,000, but if we don't get those 110,000 unless we step up and act intelligently with our immigration policy, because we're not reaching the birth rates that we need, then there won't be economic prosperity. And by 2015, it's not 200,000 will be missing, but rather if we want to maintain our historic rates of growth over the last 20 years, and if you want to keep a good level of productivity, because we've grown so far based on productivity, but there's a decreasing marginal growth, so we can't really do a lot. We can't get more juice out of the lemon thanks to digitization. Well, we can give a little further squeeze. We've got not so much a problem of productivity, but of size of the cake. And we're going to need 400,000 people if we just want to keep this country prosperous. Otherwise, we'll grow less. We'll get all wrinkly like the Japanese are. And that's what's going to happen to us. And we're worried, of course, because the raw material that in the Basque country is talent, is skilled people. And we're living in a European region, an autonomous region, because there are other autonomous regions that don't have this problem. You go to some other regions, the people that come to see us and they say, well, we don't have that problem. We don't have a lack of skilled labor. So this is a problem, a lack of skilled labor. You know what happens when labor, with a scarcity of something, the price will go up. Loli and Raul, I actually don't fully agree. Well, actually, I don't agree quite a lot with what Eduardo is saying. The demographic analysis is correct. It is true that in a few years, we've been working on this. We've highlighted to Confebasque, and they, define the lack of jobs which they're not able to fill with skilled workers. Can you define that? One of the agreements that we have on social dialogue, which is the new skills framework, actually is trying to act upon that, to work on which skills, which qualifications, where the needs are for the future. And we're talking about lifelong learning, and this is something that we need to accept. But I actually don't fully agree with this idea that we have problems in the Basque country. In the Basque country, there are slightly over 110,000 people unemployed. So if you say there's a lack of skills or a lack of professions, maybe it's to do with the kind of job or the quality of the job that's being offered. What we cannot accept in the country is that we've got very skilled people, highly qualified, but at the same time, the majority, for example, of youngsters in this country spend 10 years in precarious jobs, which means that they cannot initiate a life project. I think that's where we need to insist, and we need to prepare transition. Of course we do. The technological transition and the digital one. And now what we need is to be able to define what skills, what qualifications, what are the needs? What are the upskill needs or the reskilling needs for people to access employment? And then there's the issue of immigration. We're not so concerned about demographic change, but whether we are able to attract people, and when we do attract people, whether we can guarantee their future. But I really insist the key problem at the moment isn't so much a lack of skills, but rather the quality of employment that's being offered to people. And what it means is that it's really difficult to fill posts. Thank you, Loli. Raul. Of course there are going to be effects. The data are there, and facts don't lie. I think the birth rates that we're seeing as well over recent years, we've seen that practically since 2010 to today, we've gone from 21,000 births in the year 2010 to 14,000 in the year 2021 so far. Of course, that's going to affect the labour market, but we need to turn this into an opportunity that's linked to the creation of new jobs that are linked to population aging. The policies that we're following and social dialogue, and there are several agreements that are related to this. One main ones that we've made about how this is going to affect industry, how this is going to help us to a fair transition to business 4.0. And here, I think we're going to be doing this with all policies, is the need for there to detect what companies and also what workers needs. Here we're going to move on and of course talk about lifelong learning and training, because the education that we have is going to change. This is key. As I said earlier, there's the role of public employment offices. In our case, Lanbide, we've got 118,000 people in Lanbide looking for a job. Something that we highlight time and time again is that over 50% are over 45 years old, many of whom are not very qualified. I'm not saying that they've not been trained, but they don't have the qualifications. So this, as Luli said, we are asking the Employers Association, we don't want this sentence, no, we don't have qualified skilled labourers. It shouldn't just end there. It should help, through that sentence, us try to find out what needs Lanbide has, which is precisely to match what a company needs with the unemployed. This is important, and I think things are being done. Both the basket employment strategy, all the programs that we're agreeing upon, the three corners. One of the main needs is to survey that and find out and assess whether the policies that we are implementing, because we spend an awful lot of many millions euros on training, and yet at the end we don't seem to be able to reverse this idea that change this idea that we're not able to train people to cover companies' needs, to cover business needs. This is something we need to all sit down and think about, all social partners. Because it's the ultimate goal. Get those job seekers spending less time unemployed, and if they're over the age of 45, I think we have an obligation as a society for these people to have a new opportunity. We can't accept as trade unions and as a government and as employers association that the over 45s become chronically unemployed. Raul. Elena, thank you. Elena, you're the Deputy Minister, and one of your areas of responsibility is employment. What about demography in the medium and long term? Several things have been mentioned here. I think there are two main demographic issues that need to be dealt with in the coming years, and many of the people that are sitting here belong to the baby boomer generation. So we're going to be maybe the ones that are most harmed in this story, although I've never felt that so far. Once I started getting older, then I suddenly realized, oh, this isn't looking good. But before we look at these two challenges, one is an increase in life expectancy, and the other is the problem of large sectors of the population of a certain age without any people replacing them. There's something that the women have been doing for many years now, which is to fight against ageism. We've actually fought against gender stereotypes for many years, and it would now seem that we need to fight against ageism, because at the end, this is one of the major reasons for discrimination in companies and in society in general. So I want to appeal against gender stereotypes and age stereotypes. People say that older workers are less productive or more likely to take sick leave. I think that's just not realizing what actually is true. And one of the reasons that we have these 120,000 people unemployed, the majority of which are over the age of 45, is down to ageism. What is clear is what's going to happen in the next years, which is an increasing number of older workers in companies, a much quicker generational change. People are going to retire, and I come from the public administration. It's not just one or two people that are retiring, but great waves of people are retiring in a larger diversity of the number of people, the kinds of people that are working at a company. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about women that are now, but also all immigrants and immigration, which is here to stay. This is going to force us to do things differently. It's going to force us to have workplace risk prevention that includes ages, and this traditional way of doing things in which I retire and you just then turn up afterwards is not the best way of doing about things. And in fact, in Lambida there are mentoring projects in which I gradually leave, but you gradually arrive, and we exchange knowledge. So we need to find some kind of a balance between supply and demand, and that via immigration is going to be increasingly important in the Basque Country. And we're going to need to manage our cultural diversity. The other day I was visiting a company in which everybody had a headset in which people were given the orders in the language in which they're used to, not just Spanish and Basque, but Senegalese, French, Arabic, or whatever. And how are we going to face this demographic challenge? I think in the Basque Country we've got the tool of social dialogue to implement these kind of measures, these new policies that will help companies find workers, to find jobs that improve their personal development, and so that they can be independent and, of course, free. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes left, I've been told. So I'd ask you to be specific. We've got a final set of issues now, which is to talk about the agreements that have been reached. The consensus has been reached. There's an agree on Industry 4.0, the extending of furlough schemes, etc. But let's talk now about quality employment. This is something that's really, really key in this event. And quality employment, there's two sides to it. Firstly, the working conditions of the workers that allow that person to have opportunities. And of course, in addition to that, this employment needs to grow in the private sector, and of course public sector too, but in the private sector. So I'm just wondering, what are the basic agreements that have been reached? Because we know that there's been agreements on quality of employment, both on the worker side of things and on the business side of things. The businesses that put this employment contract on the table. Let's start with Loli. Quite clearly, we know what quality employment is. Well, we know what it isn't. We've got a labour market, and we've been suffering in this labour market some very, very high levels of precarious employment. And when we talk about precariousness, we're talking about temporary contracts, short-term, temporary contracts, part-time contracts which people don't want, and other kinds of employment. And it's youngsters that suffer from that. They go from one temporary contract to another, and that means that they don't have any life projects, even a small life project. And we need to move away from that model. We need to be able, in this country, to combine quality employment that give us guarantees for the people that they can survive in good conditions, but also guarantees companies. And we need to find internal flexibility measures. And some of the things we're talking about, the example of furlough schemes in the pandemic is quite clear. There was a situation in which the economy had come to a standstill, and we've managed to maintain the majority of jobs with some relatively appropriate conditions. So we need to explore that avenue, but there need to be legal limits, legal caps to that. There need to some kind of legal regulations to restrict precariousness and temporary contracts, because it's one of the main problems of the country. We mentioned it earlier. There's a figure that sometimes goes unnoticed in the Basque Country, which is that there are almost 220,000 people who are working in the Basque Country who are actually signed up in Lambidi but want better jobs. And that's related to the kind of job that has been created in recent years. And what kind of job we want? Good labour conditions, good salary levels, and stability. So we need to deal with other issues relating to a work-life balance, so as to be able to have a dignified life project. Anton Costa said this earlier. This is part of the inequalities that are being created, and these are related to those bad jobs that have been created in recent years. There are many, many things still to be done. We've passed the employment strategy, and we need to work, as I was saying, on new labour regulations which provides flexibility mechanisms in companies via furlough schemes, but at the same time limits the temporary nature of many contracts, which is also necessary. Thank you, Loli. Eduardo. Yes, in the public and the private sector, it's reasonably good quality employment. We've got the best labour conditions together with Madrid and the whole of Spain. 85% of private employment in Spain is permanent, on permanent contracts. We've got the highest level of salaries together with Madrid. A net wage of 1,600 euros after 3 years of employment, after having left, after having graduated. Of course, everything can be improved upon, but I refuse. I don't know what kind of quality employment the public sector offers, but I don't think the private sectors can be blamed for bad employment, bad quality employment. That's the first point. Secondly, we keep on hearing people saying, and yet we don't seem to want to really touch upon this subject. I don't know if you listen to what Nadia Calvino said. She said business competitiveness, economic growth, and quality employment. And it's the appropriate order to get quality employment. Competitiveness, economic growth, and employment. If we listen to the previous speaker, they said, oh, where do good jobs come from? From good companies. So I think what we need first and foremost is realize that quality employment is created in competitive companies, and for that you need a social contract, so that first the territory needs to be competitive. That is, the soil needs to be well fertilized. That requires a good social environment for good business activity and a labour market in which the labour market collaborates with the business with private companies, but also that requires responsibility from companies. But we think it's something that everybody is engaged in. It's not something that just depends on the management. The workers need to commit that their companies are productive, beat the competitors, provides value to the customer so that they can increase the price and the customer can be sold. And that means commitment. And I've never heard anybody say commitment. You need some kind of social commitment for companies, a collective commitment inside the company as a shared project which is based on trust to get competitiveness. And if we don't talk about this, we can keep on talking till the cows come home. We won't be competitive, we won't be growing, and we won't have employment, good employment, except for in the public sector. Thank you so much, Eduardo. It's now Elena's turn, and then we'll move on to Raul.
I believe in the Basque Country there's jobs with lots of quality and others with very little quality. So we have a dual labor market, and there are some collective bargainings that have very good working conditions and others that are precarious. So we shouldn't only look at one side of the coin, but look at the global view of our reality. And if we don't do what we need to get done, then we will have less quality employment and more employment with lack of quality. One of the things we need to do is to maintain competitive companies with high productivity levels. And I believe that with everyone's commitment, we will be able to do so. Quality employment is one more element beyond competitiveness. Anton Costa said, and I really liked his last comment, because up till now it seemed that only bad employment was considered to be productive, or social justice was going against growth. But in fact, we see more and more what's the reality, which is just the opposite. Without quality employment, we won't have quality companies. So it's something that comes together. We won't have one without the other. It's not that one is a consequence of the other, but that they feed each other. It's like the chicken and the egg. We're not able to agree on what came first. But what I do believe is that the Basque Country creates quality employment, but also non-quality employment, and therefore we need to have more growth of quality employment. And this has two sides. First of all, social dialogue. In the Basque Country, we need to work more in depth on the social dialogue. It was complex to get here and to structure it, and it's even more complex to maintain it because there are too many voices saying that social dialogue is not profitable. And as I said at the beginning, I don't believe we're talking about profitability. I just believe it's essential. And then we have collective bargaining. So some rest importance to collective bargaining and labor relationships. For some companies, this seems to be the last thing in their priority list, and I believe they're wrong. And others consider that the tension and conflict per se is going to achieve, I don't know what their aims are, but I know they're not going to have quality businesses and quality employments through this. So I believe we need to bear in mind all of this and all these relationships and without any preconceived ideas, because we are not good or bad or white or black. What we want is to achieve the Basque Country we are all working for. Thank you, Elena. Raúl, what about employment and quality? Yes, this is something that we had to get to. I see it in a completely different manner to the way in which Eduardo sees it. I believe in general, as Elena said, temporary contracts. If we take the volume of workers, and this is also related to their age, this gives you a situation of around 75% of workers that have a long-lasting contract compared to those that have a temping one. But the data is not only related to this. What we're saying is that this year of 625,000 contracts up to October in the Basque Country, 626,000 of 675,000 are precarious contracts. And if we look at the duration of these contracts, if we look at production, as 70% of these contracts last less than a month, and 40% are part-time contracts. So I ask, what are the kind of businesses that we have that uses flexibility in this manner? What we want in the reform and in everything we're saying is that we recover causality in employment. If the job has a long-lasting nature, then the contract should also be a long-lasting contract. We all know of friends and relatives that have been in a company and with different contracts, and the business association have to lose the fear of giving them this contract, because this will improve the competitiveness of the businesses. Because these workers, if they live with uncertainty regarding their future, it is very difficult for them to feel engaged. Those workers that know they're going to be there for 4 or 5 months, then they are unemployed, then they come back again. The quality employment we were mentioning has to do with the definition of the ILO, and there are many things affecting it, not only wage, but also work-life balance, because new generations give importance to many other things beyond the pay. So we have to work on this jointly, because they need to have good wages, it has to be stable, it needs to be safe, because safety is also having an influence, and we see that this rotation in the market labor is increasing the incidents in the labor market, and all of this with social protection. So what Loli has mentioned is that we need to find alternatives, so that the first measure, as soon as there is a problem, is not just to finalize contracts. And the pandemic has demonstrated this is true. We've had more than 200,000 workers in exceptional conditions, and now a year and a half later, we're at 1,000 unemployed to get to the data of February 2019. So it's a tool that has worked, and it's a tool that in social dialogue we need to be able to use, not only so that people are not fired, but also so that companies use this opportunity for reskilling, because changes are so quick that we need to retrain and reskill our workers. And I believe that has to be the work that has to be put in. And we need to give a step forward and continue to do so. When you have reasons to being fired, then we know that firing someone is not expensive, and having an indefinite contract doesn't make it very different. But some part of the businesses are now used to, in a scandalous manner, using only temporary contracts, and that's the way in which we see it. And we are a union, and as a union we are concerned that they talk about lack of commitment, because we, and I believe the other unions here, have always shown our commitment with Basque companies. Thank you, Raúl. And it's always very brief, and the same thing happened the last year, because I always have to finish when we are getting to the best part. I don't know, you can give you more time. So we're going to have a stop here, but it seems that we reach consensus through disagreements, and the first way of being able to talk and discuss is through this kind of conversations. I suppose these conversations are even more interesting behind closed doors, but now we have the agreements of the 14th, and we need to work with both workers and businesses that because of their size sometimes cannot compete, but they're doing so successfully, and we see it in the data for exports. So this support to both workers and businesses, and working together with the government to make sure that this stool is able to have these 3 legs. And with life expectancy, I don't know if we will continue being here in 40 years, but thank you all. Thank you for being here again, and thank you for reaching consensus through your conversations, discussions, and dissent. Thank you.